the WATE.com Digital Center, answering your legal questions. This is Ask Isaacs. Now, here's Lori Tucker and attorney Greg Isaacs.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us live. I'm Lori Tucker, along with our legal analyst, Greg Isaacs. Thanks for being here.
Lori, it's good to be here.
We're talking about riots, protests, and the law. Los Angeles has had extensive violent protest really over recent weeks over President Donald Trump's expansive immigration raids. And Greg, things have really escalated over the last few days.
They have. Over the last few days, the protest turned into riots, which turned into the federal government calling in the National Guard and actually the U.S. Armed Forces. I believe at last count up to 700 Marines. So it's interesting to see whether this has hit its crescendo, and it depends on which media outlet is showing you the particular riot protest at a particular time, because some of the protests where people are peacefully assembling in the road and basically walking toward law enforcement with their hands behind their back, wanting to be arrested. Now, on the other hand, there is what I would characterize as riots, where you have burning vehicles, you have projectiles being thrown at law enforcement. Obviously, a problem that is not condoned by the First Amendment. But you see this dichotomy playing out in Los Angeles, and it's kind of hard to draw the line, even though there's 27 legal shades between black, white, protest, riot.
And before we get to those, because there is a lot to talk about, a lot of different laws. We're going to talk about Tennessee law when it comes to protesting versus rioting. But let's go ahead, and before we get to what the law says about these protests or riots, let's bring you up to date on what's happening right now in L.A. Let's take a look.
A prayer vigil in downtown Los Angeles Tuesday night, with clergy members calling for peace and solidarity with immigrants. We're nearing a week since protests began over immigration arrests in the city. Mayor Karen Bass, hoping to stop late-night vandalism, issued an overnight curfew for about 1 square mile section of downtown L.A. Some people violating that curfew. City officials say about 20 people were arrested. President Trump deploying more than 4,000 National Guard troops and 700 Marines to Los Angeles, where there are now more active troops than in Iraq and Syria. Their role in dispersing crowds has been minimal, but ICE posting these photos on their X account showing National Guardsmen providing protection for ICE agents on a raid in Los Angeles. Governor Gavin Newsom claiming democracy is under assault.
And by the way, Trump, he's not opposed to lawlessness and violence as long as it serves him.
He filed a motion Tuesday to stop troops from accompanying ICE on raids, which goes beyond protecting buildings, arguing it will escalate tensions.
Donald Trump's government isn't protecting our communities. They're traumatizing our communities.
Trump posting on social media today more criticism of Newsom, calling him incompetent, accusing him of not protecting ICE officers in a timely manner. The protests against ICE have spread to other cities from coast to coast.
Hands off our students!
In New York City, police and protesters clashing. Dozens of people arrested. Texas Governor Greg Abbott says he will deploy National Guard troops ahead of protests planned this week, in his words, to ensure peace and order. And California is trying to stop federal troops from accompanying ICE officers on those raids. A hearing is scheduled for tomorrow. Jacqueline Lee, ABC News, Los Angeles.
All right, so there is the latest. We also have even more coming in. 200 people arrested, accused of breaking curfew, failure to disperse. As we mentioned, Marines ready to deploy, about 700 of them. They're outside L.A. at last check, still undergoing training, according to officials. And you heard in that story from ABC's Jacqueline Lee, there's a nationwide spread now, if you will. Protests similar to those in L.A. are planned for other cities. So let's back up a little bit and talk about when a protest, Greg, goes from free speech to breaking the law.
Well, Lori, let's begin at the beginning when our founding fathers, the First Amendment, the very first thing they included in the United States Constitution was the fact that the Constitution protected and Congress could make no law abridging the exercise of free speech or the press. And as we see here, the right of people to peacefully assemble and petition the government for redress of grievances.
So keyword here, peacefully.
It's the key word in that fundamental constitutional safeguard is peacefully assemble. So, somewhere along the way, the words of the Constitution have gotten misconstrued when, people say it's my First Amendment right to do this, to do that, hate speech, and it's not a commonsensical or legal interpretation of what the Constitution and our heritage and our jurisprudence permits.
You were talking earlier about the 27 different shades of gray and black and white. Let's talk about the different laws here and what Tennessee says, because I know there are misdemeanors all the way up to where you could really get in trouble if you go over the line.
Well, time and time again, and when you see protests that morph into riots, and you see the deployment of National Guard, and you see the troops and local law enforcement, really it's nothing new in our heritage. I mean, when you go back to the Boston Tea Party, when you go back to a number of things,
Yeah, we'll delve into that history in a moment. Yeah.
But what the government can do is regulate the time, place, and manner of a protest. So they can require you to protest in and again, let's go back to the key word that you touched on, peacefully protest and petition the government for redress of your grievances.
This is anything but.
It's anything but. But, well, again, we're seeing a snippet here, and then over here on down the road, there's some that are being peaceful and compliant.
And people are furious over these immigration raids, and that's what this stemmed from.
And that's kind of a separate issue in and of itself, because if you're in the country illegally, you're in the country illegally. You don't have a right to be here. So, to me, that's kind of an oxymoron when you see the Governor Newsom, and you see people protesting that ICE is doing this or doing that. Well, I don't know any good way, pretty way you can go in and try to extract people that don't want to leave, that are violating. So
the point I was trying to make is people are. This is such a polarizing issue.
Well, it's
that
a
it's bringing
polarizing
this
issue
reaction
because
out.
we have had such a porous border, and now when you try to strictly, back to the 27 shades of gray between black and white. Well, this to me is black or white. You're either here legally or illegally, and you are allowed to be detained by ICE. So, I think that the manner and the optic is sparked some protest, but to me, that what is lost in the protest / riot, and again, once you morph from a peaceful protest to a riot that obstructs roadways, is violent, destroys property, you throw projectiles at law enforcement, that is a riot, and that is carte blanche, black letter law, not constitutionally permissible. But at the end of the day, let's say you win your protest, and they say, okay, we're going to hit pause, and we're going to calm down. What would you like, you 10,000 people, wreaking havoc down the streets of Los Angeles? Well, we don't want ICE to be here. Well, why is ICE here? Because there's a ton of illegal immigrants. So if you kind of look at it this way, if there was one illegal immigrant, could law enforcement or ICE go in and arrest that person, send them to New Orleans, where most of them go, to be detained and then have their due process? Absolutely. But the problem is, again, the border has become so porous. Now we're trying to remediate or fix something that's been broken. So it's creating this havoc. But at the end of the day, if everybody stopped and listened to the protesters, unless there's a change in our immigration laws, their redress is not going to be effectively heard by government.
And then there's this issue, and that is California's governor versus the president, and now he's suing the president.
Well, it won't be the first time that the Trump administration or any administration has been sued. And I don't care if you're Trump, Biden, Obama. I went back and looked at some of the statistics. Actually, under President Biden, and this, I'm not looking at this from the prism of a Trump, Biden, Bush, Obama situation, but there were more people deported under Biden. But the optics weren't as severe. I never saw footage of someone being physically arrested, detained, and deported, and I've had clients that were. So that's kind of an interesting dynamic. But, what is getting lost, and back to Governor Newsom, under our system of government, when you have a governor, you have the right to control the state of California. There is political professional comedy that normally you respectfully reach out to a governor and say, would you like our assistance? But once you invoke a law such as the Insurrection Act, that governor's authority and input goes out the window.
And the governor's saying, hey, the president is an authoritarian. We're going to learn more about this lawsuit right here. Let's take a look.
A federal judge is considering whether to block President Donald Trump from sending the National Guard into Los Angeles. California Governor Gavin Newsom has blamed President Trump for the escalating situation in L.A. Earlier this week, the president ordered National Guard and Marines into that city.
Democracy is under assault before our eyes. This moment we have feared has arrived.
California Governor Gavin Newsom calls this an assault on democracy. President Donald Trump ordered thousands of federal troops into Los Angeles following protests over immigration raids.
He chose more force. He chose theatrics over public safety.
President Trump says he made Los Angeles safer.
By having the military, it de-escalates. I mean, that was the only way.
The pair traded insults on Tuesday.
This brazen abuse of power by a sitting president inflamed a combustible situation.
The governor of California, the mayor of Los Angeles, they're incompetent.
In Los Angeles, the mayor instituted an 8 p.m. curfew enforced by the LAPD. Protesters also clashed with police and a car in Chicago. In Austin, Texas, protests turned violent. 13 people were arrested. Governor Greg Abbott says he will deploy the National Guard across the state. And as military officials prepare to celebrate the Army's 250th birthday on Saturday in Washington, D.C., President Trump warned anybody who plans to protest.
If there's any protester wants to come out, they will be met with very big force.
Activist groups have more protests planned across the country this weekend. The Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem says the Trump administration will continue its immigration raids and enforcement. In Washington, I'm Vinay Simlot. Back to you.
All right. Thank you, Vinay, for that report. So over this lawsuit, you're saying that it's kind of a moot point that the president has the power to do this.
He does, but when you hear what Governor Newsom says, I think legally it doesn't have some standing. And then when you hear what President Trump said, if anybody, quote, protest the military parade on his birthday, they're going to be arrested. Well, that's unconstitutional. If they are peacefully assembling to protest, they have the absolute right to do so. Gavin Newsom, if they feel there is an insurrection, then the federal government has the right to react. And again, not to reuse this metaphor, but the spectrum of when are you using too much force, when are you escalating, you go back to the origin of it legally, and you have people that are, if they are rioting, breaking the law, and the government has the right to intervene. So, that's, I kind of differ, and it's kind of both sides, are using hyperbole and this vitriol and acrimony and histrionics. I don't think it's the death of democracy. I think it's supercharging immigration violations. But there's got to be a measured response with force. Now, where that
measured response, though, how do you have a measured response to violence?
Well, you're only allowed to use reasonable force. It's like, when can you use deadly force in Tennessee? You have to use reasonable force under the circumstances. And I think as the protests and riots start to quell and they start to atrophy, then I think that you don't have a military encampment. I think you kind of de-escalate the situation.
This is a scary situation. Reporters are getting injured who are out there being shot with those rubber bullets. We've had a couple showing their injuries. I mean, it's out of hand, obviously.
Well,
and we know where it starts, but how do you finish it in a peaceful way?
But let's juxtapose recently when we had the Black Lives Matter encampments and protests, and there was a major city, and correct me if I'm wrong, was it Seattle or was it somewhere in that 6 city blocks was shut down, and they actually had a tent encampment, people walking around with armed weapons, and the Biden administration didn't react. So, do you let someone openly violate the law, not peacefully protest, and not respond? Or on the other hand, do you meet the response with a platoon of Marines and have more deployed than you do overseas? So that therein lies the question, and that's where the district court, and here's what's going to be interesting. So if you filed a lawsuit to Gavin Newsom, the district court's asking for a restraining order. You want extraordinary relief, so you have to prove that you are entitled to this relief, and there's a likely probability that this relief would be granted. I don't know that you're going to meet that very high legal standard to say that at times the riots in Los Angeles did not rise to the level of an insurrection which would justify deployment of federal troops. But then again, a day later, I think it may be that the protests, which have atrophied and waned down, that now becomes not a riot but a protest, may not justify deployment under the Insurrection Act.
It depends on what city block you're on.
It depends on what city block you're on.
Okay, let's talk about those 200 people who were taken into custody overnight for failure to disperse. What charges can they face?
Well, I'm not sure under California law, but I know under Tennessee law, we have a very strong prohibition against riots. It only takes 3 or more people to legally constitute a riot. And this is what's important, and it's interesting that our legislature keyed in on this. You have the charge of unlawful rioting morphs into aggravated rioting if you have significant damage to person or property, or you have people coming in from out of state, or you have people that are paid to riot. And what we hear time and time again on both sides, whether it's Black Lives Matter, whether it's Vietnam, whether it's now this immigration, that there are a ton of people that are being paid and that aren't here.
A coordinated effort to bring in the folks, the people, to escalate the numbers, escalate the whole situation. Let's leave it here. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll take a look at the history of these protests and riots here in Tennessee and nationwide. Stay with us. Welcome back, everybody. We are talking about the riots and protests going on in LA, threatening to disperse around the country in different hotspots. And let's go back in history. 1963, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, the MLK I Have a Dream moment in time. We have the 1969 anti-Vietnam War protest in Washington. Over 500,000 people took part in that. And that was the era when we talked about and saw flag burning. So let's talk about the law when it comes to things like that, because the law is very specific when it comes to desecrating the American flag.
Well, in Tennessee, it is a criminal offense to intentionally desecrate a national flag, a religious monument, or monument, statue, a church. So it is carte blanche off the law. Also, in Tennessee, it's against the law if you're protesting to block a roadway, to block a sidewalk, anything that the public would have ingress and egress to.
A bridge.
A bridge. if you prohibit an emergency vehicle from doing it, it becomes a more serious criminal offense. It becomes an aggravated offense. But every time when we see something like this, it's easy to say that this is the worst thing we've ever seen. Legally, the constitutional has been shredded and collapsed, and our democracy is collapsing. But if you look at our history, the pendulum just perpetually swings. As you just alluded to, in 1963, I Have a Dream, MLK. 1969, anti-war Vietnam protest, anti-nuclear protests. We've seen those in Oak Ridge. We've seen people being arrested.
And remember 2017, and I'll never forget that year, the Women's March was the largest single-day demonstration in U.S. history. 5.2 million people took part in that.
And, then you had in 2020 the George Floyd I Can't Breathe riots. But, what really, when you analyze this from a legal and historical perspective, what you see often, it reminds me of kind of like the Globetrotters that play these different teams over and over and over. It's almost like if somebody wins the Super Bowl in Philadelphia, you have a riot, you burn vehicles. You have NBA
you burn a
championship,
couch.
you burn whatever. but it's there are people there that are genuinely trying to petition the government for their redresses, but there are people out there to riot. And the message gets lost in the mayhem. And I think that's why it's so hard to legally separate First Amendment riot protest. So when you see someone like the president say, if you protest, you're going to get arrested. Well, how can that happen? Because how many
gotta be more than
many
that.
people protested Stop the Steal? And how
Right.
many people were January 6th were there, whether it was just a protest or an insurrection? So both sides have the right to
A lot of people are talking about that.
peacefully petition. And again, this is not a partisan issue. This is a First Amendment issue. So there's not a right or a wrong to it. But we're having a No King's Day protests that are coming up.
What caused this is definitely a partisan issue. But the response to it.
Well, I don't think illegal immigration is a partisan issue. I think it's a partisan issue if you choose to enforce it or you over-enforce it or how you enforce it.
Depends on who you talk to.
Well, I mean, if you're illegal, you're illegal.
Yeah.
You can change the law. But, here's what people forget. In Knoxville, Tennessee, that's where we are, the mothership here on Ask Isaacs.
We're the mothership now.
The mothership. Billy Graham came to town during
1960.
During the Vietnam War. He filled.
I'm sorry, 1970. That's a little early for the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
It may have been starting barely, but 1970.
And so Billy Graham packed Neyland Stadium. Richard Nixon showed up and made a few remarks, and there was a riot. People were arrested because we just went into Cambodia.
47 people were charged with disorderly conduct or disrupting a religious service because it was a Billy Graham event.
Right. So
Yeah.
So the more things change, the more they remain the same. But we've been dispersing troops and putting people in jail over issues of slavery, racism, Black Lives Matter. If anyone's a history buff, whatever, if you look at the suffragette movement. Knoxville had a famous protest / riot where some of the leading suffragettes came here to talk and have an organizational meeting. The sheriff actually tried to lock up the suffragettes for exercising their right to free speech.
In some of the worst areas, some of the worst cells.
Right.
In town.
And some union members then in turn locked the sheriff and his deputies in the Knox County Courthouse jail, and the protest was allowed to continue.
Which were much nicer.
Which were much nicer. But my point was the protest and the acrimony and the overreaction, underreaction has been going on ever since we founded this country when we decided to have the Boston Tea Party. That wasn't done peacefully.
That's true. Hey, what do you think is going to happen? We've got about 4 minutes left. What do you think is going to happen with the Newsom lawsuit?
I think if the judge, I think it would be precipitous and legally unsubstantiated to issue a temporary restraining order under the high legal standard under the federal rules of civil procedure. I think it would then go on an expedited fashion to the Court of Appeals and Supreme Court, and I do not think that you would get any relief. But the question is does this factual scenario, which is fluid as we've seen from the coverage, depending on what channel you watch or what feed we saw, does it justify invoking the Insurrection Act to deploy federal troops? And again, it's like you said, maybe one block it does, down the block it doesn't. Yesterday it was, now today it wasn't.
A fire on one block, somebody holding a sign peacefully standing there, another. This is a tough one.
But you know, it's really weird. As proactive as government becomes, then the district courts try to react and are hard to keep, and it's hard to keep pace. You know, but at the end of the day, you see the courts reacting and getting relief in extreme scenarios, and really not knowing what to do as they kind of reason their way through uncharted territory. So at the end of the day, even if Governor Newsom wins in his district court, I think that'll be a short-lived victory.
All right. No telling how long this is going to go on.
And again, this weekend, more protests on the horizon.
June 14th is Saturday.
Yeah.
That is a big day for the president and for people who are saying, listen, we're going to make our voices heard as well.
But, you know, let's just do this. Just remember, you have an absolute right to peacefully protest, whether you're for someone, against someone, but you do not have the right under state or federal law to riot.
We're going to leave it at that. We've got about 2 minutes left. So let's wrap this up and bring it back to Tennessee, because I know there are whispers that Knoxville might be a scene of protest. I don't want to go too far into that to incite anything. We don't know where, we don't know exactly when, but let's talk about what could happen if you want to walk out, take part in that. How do you participate without getting in trouble? I know the key word is just be peaceful.
Well, one, and this is and it's ingrained in our disorderly conduct statutes, whatever. Be responsive to law enforcement. Don't think that you know what your rights are more than they know, because what trumps it is you commit a crime if you disobey a lawful command of law enforcement. So if you sit here and go, I have the right under the First Amendment to sit here and petition my grievance and I'm not moving, no, you have to listen. But remember, you are allowed to have a peaceful protest. That's an orderly gathering where you have your signs.
But you can't do it just anywhere. I mean, like you have to participate where you're allowed.
You can't obstruct traffic. You can't do that. And then law enforcement has the companion duty to give people the latitude and respect. But maybe some people want to be arrested. Martin Sheen, the actor, famous actor, has been arrested 72 times for being involved in peaceful protest. And he'll show up, walk toward law enforcement, put his hands behind him, and they gladly put him in jail, and he gladly goes to jail. So,
so it's just a simple act of putting your hands behind you.
Well, that's someone's method to peacefully protest and whatever. So, that's way miles beyond the person that's throwing the Molotov cocktail at the vehicle or throwing something at law enforcement. And again, those penalties are severe and those penalties are swift. But whether it's Knoxville, Tennessee, most places in this country, we've had people that have rioted and done things that have been incarcerated. And I think we're seeing it as we air, and we're going to see it tonight. We're going to see it tomorrow. And when the pendulum goes back the other way, we're going to see it again.
And it will. All right.